He wasn't supposed to bark like that. Not at a funeral. Not at the one man he had sworn to follow even into death. The sky hung low over Arlington, a dull sheet of gray pressing down on rows of white headstones lined with quiet precision, each one marking a story that ended too soon. A cold wind moved through the crowd, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and polished wood, brushing against the dark uniforms of officers standing shoulder to shoulder in silent formation. At the center, beneath a canopy of black, lay the coffin of Officer Daniel Hayes, draped in the American flag, its colors muted under the overcast light. No one spoke. Boots were still. Hands rested firmly at their sides. It was the kind of silence that felt earned, heavy with respect, the kind that asked nothing except stillness. And then Rex broke it. The German shepherd stood rigid at the edge of the ceremonial line, his sable coat darkened by the mist in the air, droplets clinging to the edges of his fur like glass. His ears were pinned forward, not in grief, but in focus. His amber eyes locked onto the coffin with an intensity that didn't belong in mourning. At first, it was just one bark. Sharp, controlled, enough to draw a few glances. A handler stepped forward, tightening his grip on the leash. "Easy, boy," he muttered under his breath, voice low, respectful of the setting. But Rex didn't settle. Another bark followed. Louder this time. Not frantic. Not broken. Deliberate. The kind of sound that cut through silence like a warning siren buried beneath discipline. A ripple moved through the crowd. Officers exchanged brief looks, the kind that asked questions without words. Someone near the front shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how these ceremonies went. Dogs were trained for this, conditioned to understand stillness, to mirror the calm of their handlers. But Rex didn't move like a dog remembering loss. He moved like one refusing it. His body leaned forward, muscles coiled beneath his frame, as if every instinct inside him was pulling toward the casket. The handler tugged gently, then firmer. "Rex, stay." The command hung in the air. Rex didn't obey. Instead, he stepped forward, claws scraping softly against the wet pavement, his gaze never leaving the coffin. Another bark, deeper now, echoed across the rows of uniforms, bouncing faintly against the distant trees. Somewhere behind the formation, a flag snapped sharply in the wind. The sound seemed to answer him, but Rex didn't flinch. He barked again, and again, each one measured, each one intentional. This wasn't panic. It wasn't confusion. It was insistence. A senior officer near the front turned slightly, his jaw tightening as he studied the scene. "Pull him back," he said quietly, not out of anger, but necessity. The handler moved closer, wrapping both hands around the leash now, trying to guide Rex away from the center. But Rex resisted, his weight shifting backward for a split second before he surged forward again, not aggressive, not wild, just unwavering. His focus narrowed, the world around him fading until there was nothing left but the flag-covered box ahead. The ceremony faltered. A pause, subtle but undeniable, stretched between the scheduled steps. Even the honor guard seemed to hesitate, their movements just a fraction slower, as if something unseen had entered the space and demanded attention. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of rain and polished brass, brushing past the coffin. Rex's nose twitched. His ears flicked once. And then, without warning, he lunged. Not far. Just enough. The leash snapped tight with a sharp crack, stopping him mid-step. Gasps rose, quiet but present, like a breath held too long finally released. The handler struggled to steady him, voice firmer now. "Rex, heel." But the dog didn't look at him, didn't even seem to hear. His eyes remained locked on the coffin, unblinking, unyielding, as if something inside that sealed space was calling to him in a language no human could hear. Another bark tore through the air, this one louder than all the rest. It echoed across the cemetery, carrying past the rows of silent witnesses, past the flags, past the moment itself. And in that sound, something shifted. Not in the dog, in the people watching. Because grief doesn't sound like that. And whatever Rex was trying to say, it wasn't goodbye. The handler's grip tightened, but Rex did not fight him the way an untrained dog might. There was no snapping, no chaos, only resistance with purpose, a steady pull forward as if every fiber in his body refused to turn away from the coffin. And that was when Lieutenant Marcus Doyle stepped out from the line, his polished shoes darkened by the damp ground, his eyes narrowing not in irritation but in thought, because he had worked K9 units long enough to recognize the difference between panic and signal. And this was not panic. This was something else, something older than commands and drills, something that lived deeper than obedience. "Hold him," Doyle said quietly, raising one hand, not loud enough to break the solemn tone of the ceremony, but firm enough to pause it completely. And just like that, the rhythm of the funeral shifted. The honor guard froze mid-motion. The flag detail hesitated. Even the wind seemed to settle into a low hush, as if waiting. Rex's breathing grew heavier, visible in the cool air, his chest rising and falling in sharp, controlled bursts. His nose lifted slightly now, catching something beyond the reach of human senses, and then he made a sound that did not belong to mourning at all, a low, vibrating growl that rolled from deep in his chest, not aggressive, not threatening, but warning, the kind that working dogs used in the field when something was not right, something unseen, something just out of place. Doyle's gaze shifted to the coffin, then back to Rex, then to the handler whose uncertainty was beginning to show in the tightness of his jaw. "Has he done this before?" Doyle asked under his breath. The handler shook his head quickly. "No, sir. He has been calm all morning. He walked in just fine. No issues until now." Doyle nodded once, slow, measured, his mind already moving through possibilities he did not say out loud. Because ceremonies like this were supposed to be predictable, controlled, every step rehearsed, every moment accounted for. And yet here was a trained police dog breaking every expectation without losing discipline, which made it worse, not better, because Rex was not out of control. He was choosing this, and that meant something. Another bark cut through the silence, sharper than before, and Rex lunged again, just a few inches, but enough to drag the handler forward a step, boots scraping against the wet ground. A murmur rippled through the gathered officers now, subtle but undeniable, the kind of sound that spread when instinct began to override protocol. Doyle exhaled slowly, then stepped closer, close enough to see the fine tremor in Rex's muscles, the intensity in his eyes. There was no confusion there, no grief clouding his focus, only clarity, the kind that came from training and trust. "Let him come closer," Doyle said, and the handler hesitated, instinct battling instruction. "Sir, protocol says." "I know what protocol says," Doyle interrupted, not harsh, but final. "And I also know when something does not fit." A beat passed, just long enough for the weight of that decision to settle. Then the handler loosened his grip, not fully, just enough to give Rex a few more inches, and Rex took them immediately, stepping forward with controlled urgency, his nose lowering toward the edge of the coffin, the flag shifting slightly with the breeze, brushing against the polished wood beneath. Rex sniffed once, twice, then froze, completely still, as if he had reached the exact point he needed. The crowd held its breath without realizing it. Even the distant sounds of the city seemed to fade. And then Rex did something that made the hair on the back of Doyle's neck rise. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply placed one paw gently against the side of the coffin and let out a single, quiet whine, softer than anything before, but somehow louder in meaning. Doyle's eyes flicked to the edge of the casket, to the seams, to the way the flag rested. Something about it felt off, not visibly wrong, not something you could point to in a report, but enough to unsettle a man who had spent years trusting details. "Open it," Doyle said, barely above a whisper, but in that moment it carried across the silence like a command no one could ignore. The handler looked up sharply. A few officers turned in disbelief, one of them stepping forward. "Sir, we cannot just." Doyle did not take his eyes off the coffin. "Open it," he repeated, slower this time, and Rex did not move, his paw still resting against the wood, his eyes fixed, waiting, as if whatever answer lay inside was already known to him, and he had been trying to tell them all along. For a moment, no one moved, not the officers in formation, not the honor guard, not even the wind that had been threading through the flags just seconds before. It was as if the entire cemetery had leaned into that single command and was waiting to see who would break first, the protocol or the instinct. And standing there between both was Lieutenant Marcus Doyle, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged. But there was something different in the way he held himself now, less about ceremony, more about truth, the kind that does not ask permission. One of the senior officers stepped closer, his voice low, careful. "Lieutenant, this is not standard procedure." Doyle nodded once, already expecting that. "Neither is that dog," he replied, without raising his voice. And that was enough to shift something in the air, because everyone present knew what Rex was. Not just a companion, not just a symbol, but a trained canine with years of field work. A dog that had stood in situations where human senses failed. A dog that had learned to read what could not be seen. The handler swallowed, his hands still on the leash, but no longer pulling back. Rex remained still, his paw resting against the coffin, his breathing slower now, almost patient, as if he understood that the next few seconds mattered more than anything that had come before. Doyle took one step forward, then another, closing the distance between himself and the casket. The polished wood reflected a faint, distorted image of the sky above, dull and endless. And for a brief second, Doyle hesitated, not from doubt, but from the weight of what it meant to question something that had already been accepted. He reached down, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge where the lid met the base, feeling for something, anything, a detail out of place. Behind him, the handler shifted slightly, giving Rex just enough slack to remain at the coffin's side. The dog's ears twitched. Once, his nose lifting again, drawing in the scent that only he seemed to recognize. Doyle glanced back briefly, just enough to meet Rex's eyes, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them. Not language, not command, but understanding, a quiet agreement that whatever was about to happen, it needed to happen now. "Help me," Doyle said, turning slightly toward the nearest officer, and though there was hesitation, it was brief, because the moment had already crossed a line where certainty was no longer possible. Two officers stepped forward, their movements careful, deliberate, as if each step carried more weight than usual. Together they positioned themselves at the sides of the coffin, hands hovering just above the edges, waiting for the final decision. Doyle inhaled slowly, the cool air filling his lungs, grounding him. Then he gave a small nod, and they lifted, not fully, just enough to break the seal. A soft sound escaped as the lid shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like the opening of something that was never meant to be disturbed. Rex leaned forward slightly, not pulling, not lunging, just watching, his entire body focused on the narrow gap that had formed. Doyle's eyes followed the movement, narrowing as he peered into the opening. At first there was nothing unusual. The folded fabric, the stillness, the expected shape beneath, exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been described. But Rex did not react the way a dog would when faced with finality. He did not retreat, did not lower his head, did not fall into silence. Instead, he let out another low sound, softer than before, but insistent, and his gaze shifted, not to the face, not to the center, but slightly lower, toward the lining beneath. Doyle followed that line of sight, his attention drawn to a small detail that had gone unnoticed by everyone else, a slight unevenness in the interior fabric, barely visible, something that might have been dismissed as a fold or a shadow, but in that moment, it felt deliberate. Doyle's brow tightened, his hand moving closer, fingers brushing against the edge of the lining, testing it. And then he paused, just for a second, the kind of pause that comes when a thought forms too quickly to ignore. Behind him, someone whispered, "What is it?" But Doyle did not answer, his focus locked on that single point. Rex's breathing grew heavier again, his body tensing, not in fear, but in urgency, as if whatever lay beneath that thin layer of fabric was the answer he had been trying to give them from the very beginning. Doyle exhaled once, steady, then slid his fingers beneath the edge of the lining and lifted it just enough to see underneath. And in that instant, the silence that followed was no longer respectful. It was stunned, because what they had accepted as final, as certain, as complete, suddenly felt unfinished, and Rex, still standing with one paw against the coffin, finally stilled completely, as if he had reached the end of what he needed to say, leaving the rest for them to understand. The fabric lifted only an inch at first, just enough for a sliver of shadow to break the uniform interior, and in that narrow space, something small caught the light, not reflective like metal polished for ceremony, but dull, worn, out of place. Doyle's fingers paused as his eyes adjusted, focusing past the expected, searching for the detail that Rex had refused to ignore, and then he saw it. Tucked beneath the lining where no one would normally look, a thin strip of material, darkened at the edges, barely visible against the interior. It was not part of the coffin, not part of the uniform, not part of anything that belonged in a final resting place prepared with such precision. Behind him, one of the officers leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a breath. "What is that?" Doyle did not answer right away, his hand moving carefully, slowly, as if the truth itself might slip away if he rushed it. He lifted the lining a little higher, revealing more of what lay beneath. The shape became clearer now, a small compartment, hidden, subtle, something that had been overlooked because no one had thought to question what they had been told, and inside it, secured in a way that suggested intention, was a device no larger than a matchbox, its surface scratched, its edges worn, but unmistakably deliberate. Rex shifted slightly at Doyle sighed, not stepping forward, not retreating, just watching, his breathing steady now, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for. Doyle's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in realization, because this was not an accident, not a mistake in preparation. This was something placed, something hidden, something meant to remain unseen. Until now, the officer beside him straightened slightly, his expression changing from confusion to concern. "That was not in the report," he said quietly. Doyle nodded once, still focused on the compartment. "No, it was not," he replied, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that shifted the atmosphere again. This was no longer a ceremony interrupted by a dog. This was something else entirely, something that had moved beyond protocol into the realm of questions no one had prepared to answer. The wind returned, brushing lightly against the flag draped over the coffin, causing it to ripple just enough to remind everyone present of where they stood. But the meaning of that place had changed, subtly, quietly. Doyle reached in, his fingers careful as he lifted the small device from its hidden space. It was lighter than he expected, almost fragile, yet it carried a presence that felt heavier than the coffin itself. He turned it slightly in his hand, examining it. There were no markings visible at first glance, no clear indication of purpose. But there was something familiar about its design, something that suggested it belonged not to ceremony, but to field work, to situations where details mattered and silence was often more important than words. Rex's ears flicked once, his gaze following the movement of the device, his body finally easing, just slightly, as if the tension that had held him rigid was beginning to release. Doyle glanced down at him again, and for the first time since this had begun, there was a hint of something in his expression that was not purely analytical, something closer to respect. "You knew," he murmured, not expecting an answer, but understanding had already settled in. Behind them, the murmur among the officers had grown, still controlled, still respectful, but no longer silent, the kind of sound that rises when certainty breaks and is replaced by the need to understand. One of the senior officers stepped closer now, his posture more rigid than before. "Lieutenant, we need to secure that," he said, his tone measured, but firm. Doyle did not resist, but he did not immediately hand it over either, his eyes returning briefly to the coffin, to the space beneath the lining where the device had been hidden, and then to Rex, who now stood without tension, his paw no longer pressed against the wood, his stance grounded, calm, as if his part in this had been fulfilled. Doyle exhaled slowly, then extended the device toward the senior officer. "This was not supposed to be here," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and the officer took it with careful hands, his expression tightening as he examined it. The ceremony, once defined by order and ritual, now stood suspended in uncertainty, every detail re-examined, every assumption questioned, and at the center of it all stood a dog who had refused to accept what everyone else had, not out of defiance, but out of something deeper, something trained, something trusted, something that did not rely on reports or conclusions, but on instinct sharpened by loyalty. And as the wind moved once more through the rows of silent markers, Rex finally lowered his head, not in grief, but in quiet stillness, as if the truth, whatever it was, had finally been brought into the light where it could no longer remain hidden. The device felt colder than the air around it, as if it carried its own silence, separate from the ceremony it had interrupted. and as the senior officer turned it carefully in his hands, the faint lines along its surface began to resolve into something more deliberate, not decorative, not accidental, but functional. Doyle stepped closer again, his eyes narrowing slightly as recognition began to settle in, not fully formed, but enough to stir memory, enough to pull at something buried beneath. Routine reports and final statements. This is not standard issue, the officer said quietly, almost to himself, his thumb brushing along the edge where a small indentation suggested it could be opened, but he did not press it. Not yet, because even without activating it, the presence of the device had already changed everything. Behind them, the formation had loosened just enough for subtle shifts in posture. Officers leaning in, exchanging glances, the kind that carried questions no one wanted to voice too loudly. Because the moment had moved beyond mourning into something uncertain, something unresolved, Rex remained still now, his body no longer tense, his ears relaxed but alert, his gaze moving between Doyle and the object as if tracking the truth as it passed from instinct to understanding. Doyle extended his hand slightly. "May I?" he asked, and the officer hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Passing the device back to him with careful precision, Doyle held it differently this time, not just as an object found where it did not belong, but as something that might answer a question no one had known to ask. He turned it once more, then pressed gently along the edge. The small compartment shifted with a soft click, almost inaudible, but in the stillness it sounded louder than it should have. The lid lifted just enough to reveal a thin strip inside, no larger than a piece of folded paper, but smoother, more precise. Doyle's fingers moved with deliberate care as he eased it out, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. The material caught the light faintly, revealing itself to be a microcard, the kind used in field recording, compact, secure, designed to carry information without drawing attention. Doyle exhaled slowly, his mind moving quickly now, connecting details that had not aligned before. The report, the timing, the circumstances that had led to this moment, and through it all, Rex's refusal to accept what had been presented as final. This was meant to be found, Doyle said quietly, not to anyone in particular. But the words settled over the group like a shift in gravity, because if that was true, then the presence of the device was not an error, it was intention. The officer beside him frowned slightly. "Found by who?" he asked. Doyle's gaze moved briefly to Rex, then back to the card in his hand. "By someone who would not ignore it," he replied, the implication clear without needing to be spoken aloud. "A trained dog, a partner, not bound by protocol but guided by something deeper." The officer nodded slowly, the weight of that understanding settling in. Doyle looked toward the nearby patrol unit parked at the edge of the cemetery, its presence discreet but constant. "We need to access this," he said, and though no one argued, there was a tension in the air, not resistance, but the awareness that whatever lay on that card would not be simple. It would not restore the moment to what it had been. It would move it forward into something else entirely. The officer gestured toward a younger technician who had been standing near the back. "Get the reader from the unit," he instructed, and the young man moved quickly, his steps careful but urgent. The minutes stretched in quiet anticipation, the kind that hums beneath the surface, barely audible but impossible to ignore. Rex shifted slightly, stepping back just enough to sit beside the coffin, his posture calm now, grounded, as if his part had ended the moment the device was revealed. Doyle watched him for a second, then looked down at the card again, turning it once more between his fingers. There was no visible label, no marking to explain its contents, only the weight of its presence and the silence it carried. The technician returned within moments, a small handheld device in his hand, compact and functional, designed for quick access in the field. He approached Doyle, offering it without a word. Doyle took it, his movement steady, then inserted the micro card into the slot. The device responded with a soft tone, a small screen flickering to life, its glow faint in the daylight, but enough to draw every eye closer. For a second, nothing appeared, just a blank interface waiting, and then a single file name surfaced, simple, unadorned, unmistakably deliberate. Doyle's gaze fixed on it, his thumb hovering just above the control, and in that suspended moment, before the truth revealed itself, the entire ceremony seemed to hold its breath once more, because whatever came next would not just answer a question, it would redefine everything they thought they knew. And Rex, sitting quietly at the edge of it all, did not look at the screen. He looked at Doyle, as if the answer had never been in the device at all, but in what someone had chosen to leave behind. The screen flickered once, then steadied, its faint glow reflecting in Doyle's eyes as the single file expanded without sound. No dramatic alert, no warning, just a quiet unfolding. And for a second it showed nothing but darkness, a grainy frame as if the device had been activated in low light. Then a shape began to form, subtle at first, the outline of a room, confined, sterile, not a hospital, not quite, but something in between, the kind of place where decisions were made without witnesses. Doyle leaned in slightly, his breath slow, controlled, the officers around him doing the same, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the weight of what they were about to see. And then a voice came through, low, strained, but unmistakable. If you are seeing this, then something did not go the way they planned. The words were clear despite the faint distortion, and every person within earshot felt the shift instantly, because they recognized that voice, not from reports, not from memory alone, but from years of working beside it. Officer Daniel Hayes, alive in that moment, speaking not as a man being honored, but as one leaving something behind. Rex's ears lifted slightly at the sound, his head tilting just enough to catch it fully, not startled, not confused, just attentive, as if confirming something he had already known. Doyle's grip on the device tightened almost imperceptibly, his mind racing to align the reality in front of him with the conclusion they had all accepted. The video continued, the image stabilizing just enough to show Daniel seated, his posture steady despite the tension in his expression, his uniform partially visible, not formal, not prepared for ceremony, but real, present. I did not have time to file this through the system, Daniel said, his voice measured, deliberate, every word chosen carefully. So I hid it where I knew it would be found by the one partner who would not ignore it. Doyle's eyes flicked down for a fraction of a second toward Rex, then back to the screen, the connection settling in fully now. This was not chance, not luck. This was trust placed in instinct. The video shifted slightly as if the device had been adjusted, the angle changing just enough to reveal a hint of movement in the background, indistinct shapes, shadows that did not fully resolve, but enough to suggest that Daniel had not been alone when this was recorded. His voice lowered slightly, not out of fear, but caution. There is something wrong with the report, he continued. What they wrote is not what happened. The words landed heavier than any formal statement ever could, because they carried the certainty of someone who had been there, who had seen what others had not. Doyle felt the weight of that sentence settle into the space around him, altering it completely. The ceremony no longer paused, but transformed, the past no longer fixed, but shifting. Rex rose slowly from where he had been sitting, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with purpose. Stepping closer to Doyle, his gaze fixed on the device, on the voice that had once guided him through countless moments. The video continued, Daniel's expression tightening slightly as he spoke, not in fear, but in urgency. If you are watching this, then they closed the case too fast, he said. And they did not look where they needed to look. A faint sound in the background interrupted him, not loud, but enough to make him glance briefly to the side, then back to the recording, his tone sharpening just slightly. There is a location, he added, not in the file, not in the report, but it is there, and it matters. Doyle's mind was already moving, cataloging, preparing, but he did not interrupt, did not pause the video, because whatever Daniel had left behind was not meant to be fragmented. It was meant to be heard in full. The wind moved again through the cemetery, brushing past the gathered officers, carrying the faint sound of the recording outward, blending the past and present into a single moment. Rex stood beside Doyle now, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched the man's leg, his presence steady, grounded, as if anchoring the moment. The video neared its end, Daniel's voice softening just slightly, not with doubt, but with something quieter, something closer to trust. Rex will know, he said, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something beyond duty in his tone, something that did not need to be explained, because it had already been lived. The screen dimmed slightly as the recording concluded, the final frame holding for a second longer than expected before fading to black. And in the silence that followed, no one spoke, because the truth had not just been revealed, it had been entrusted, and standing there between what was known and what had yet to be understood, Rex did not bark, did not move. He simply stood, eyes forward, as if waiting for them to finally listen. No one moved for several seconds after the screen went dark, not because they were unsure of what they had seen, but because they understood exactly what it meant, and that understanding carried a weight heavier than any command, heavier than the silence that had filled the ceremony before. Doyle lowered the device slowly, his eyes still fixed on the blank screen as if expecting it to speak again, but it did not. It had already said everything it was meant to say. Around him, the officers stood, no longer in formation but in suspension, their posture caught between duty and disbelief, because the man they had come to honor as fallen had just spoken to them, clear, deliberate, and undeniably alive in that moment of recording, and more than that, he had pointed them somewhere unfinished, somewhere unresolved. Rex stepped forward again, not toward the coffin this time, but toward Doyle, his movement calm, steady, his presence no longer urgent but guiding, as if the next step was not about discovery but about direction. Doyle looked down at him, the memory of Daniel's final words echoing quietly in his mind. Rex will know. It was not a metaphor, not a comfort. It was instruction. Doyle inhaled slowly, then straightened, his voice low but firm enough to carry. "We are not closing this today," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a decision. The senior officer turned toward him, his expression tight, conflicted, but not resistant, because he had heard the same voice, seen the same evidence. "The ceremony," he began, but the sentence did not finish, because there was no way to complete it without acknowledging that the meaning of this moment had changed. Doyle glanced briefly at the coffin, then back to the officers. "We will honor him," he said, "but we are not burying the truth with him." The words settled into the air, firm, measured, and something in the tension began to shift, not resolve, but direction, purpose replacing uncertainty. The technician stepped closer, still holding the reader, his voice quieter now. "Sir, the file metadata shows a timestamp." Doyle's attention snapped back. "When?" he asked. The technician glanced down, scanning the small screen. "Less than 12 hours before the official report was filed." A murmur moved through the group again, sharper this time, more focused, because that detail alone fractured the timeline they had accepted. Doyle nodded once, his mind already aligning the implications. He knew it would be buried, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Rex shifted beside him, his head turning slightly toward the edge of the cemetery, toward the line of parked patrol vehicles, then beyond them, toward the distant road that curved out of sight, his ears lifting, his posture changing just enough to signal attention. Doyle followed that movement, his gaze tracing the same direction. "You see something," he murmured, not expecting a spoken answer, but Rex stepped forward, not running, not pulling, just moving with intention, a few feet at first, then pausing, glancing back briefly, a silent check to see if he was being followed. Doyle did not hesitate. He stepped after him, the gravel beneath his shoes crunching softly, the sound breaking the last remnants of stillness that had held the ceremony in place. Behind him, the senior officer called out, "Lieutenant." But Doyle did not stop. He turned just enough to respond without breaking stride. "We will return," he said, with answers, and there was no defiance in his tone, only certainty. Rex moved again, leading now, not away from the moment, but deeper into what it had revealed. The path they followed was not marked, not formal, just a stretch of damp ground leading toward the perimeter, past the ordered rows of headstones and into the space where ceremony gave way to reality. The wind followed them, carrying the faint echo of what had just happened, but neither of them looked back, because the past had already spoken, and the next step did not lie behind them. It lay ahead, in whatever place Rex had sensed, whatever truth Daniel had trusted him to find. And as the distance between them and the gathered officers slowly grew, the meaning of loyalty shifted from memory into action, from mourning into movement, because some bonds do not end when the ceremony does. They begin again where the answers have yet to be found. The ground beyond the cemetery sloped gently toward a narrow service road, the kind used by maintenance crews and forgotten by most visitors, and Rex followed it with quiet certainty, his pace steady, his nose occasionally dipping toward the damp gravel, as if confirming each step against a memory only he carried. Doyle stayed close behind, not rushing, not calling out, because he understood now that this was not a search in the usual sense. It was a continuation of something that had already been set in motion long before the ceremony began. The wind shifted as they moved farther from the rows of headstones, carrying with it the faint scent of oil and cold metal from the parked patrol units. Blending with the earthy smell of wet grass and distant asphalt, Rex paused briefly near the edge of the road, his ears lifting, his body angling slightly toward a line of vehicles parked farther down. Not the marked cruisers near the ceremony, but a smaller cluster set apart, less visible. Doyle followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. 3 vehicles, unmarked, dark in color, positioned just beyond the main area, their presence subtle but intentional. That was not part of the procession, Doyle murmured under his breath. Rex moved again, closing the distance with controlled purpose, his posture alert but not tense, as if he recognized something rather than feared it. Doyle's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but he did not speak into it. Not yet. The situation did not feel urgent in the way that demanded immediate broadcast. It felt precise, as if every move mattered more than speed. They reached the first vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows, its surface beaded with moisture from the lingering mist. Rex circled once, slow, deliberate, his nose tracing along the lower edge of the door, then pausing near the rear. He did not bark, did not scratch. He simply stood there, still, focused. Doyle stepped closer, his reflection faint in the glass, his eyes scanning for anything out of place, a detail, a sign, something that connected this vehicle to the recording they had just witnessed. And then he saw it, small, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. A faint mark near the handle, a smudge shaped not by accident, but by repetition, as if someone had opened this door in haste more than once. Doyle reached out slowly, his fingers hovering just above the surface before making contact. The metal was cold, untouched for hours at least, but the mark remained, a silent trace of something that had already happened. Rex shifted slightly, stepping toward the second vehicle, a sedan this time, older, less conspicuous, its paint duller, its presence easier to overlook. Doyle followed again, his mind aligning the pieces, Daniel's voice, the hidden device, the instruction. There is a location, and now this. Not a place marked on a map, but a pattern, a connection between what was hidden and what remained in plain sight. Rex stopped at the driver's side door, his head lowering, his nose pressing lightly against the seam, then lifting again as he looked back at Doyle, not with urgency, but with expectation. Doyle exhaled slowly, then glanced back toward the cemetery, now partially obscured by distance and trees, the ceremony reduced to a memory unfolding behind them. "You brought him here," Doyle said quietly, the words meant for the man who had recorded the message, for the intention behind it, not for the dog. Rex did not respond. He simply held his position, steady, unwavering. Doyle reached for the handle, pausing only long enough to consider the weight of the moment. Then he pulled. The door opened with a soft sound, revealing the interior, dim, unremarkable at first glance, the kind of space that would not draw attention. But Doyle did not look at the surface. He leaned in slightly, his eyes moving with intent, scanning not for what was visible, but for what did not belong. And then he noticed it, on the passenger seat, a folded piece of paper, plain, unmarked on the outside, but placed too deliberately to be forgotten. Doyle reached in, his fingers closing around it. The paper slightly damp from the air, but intact. He stepped back, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting inside was quick, precise, unmistakably human, not printed, not formal, but urgent. A map, not detailed, not labeled, but directional. Lines and markings that pointed beyond this place, beyond the cemetery, beyond the known report. Doyle studied it for a moment, then looked down at Rex, who stood calm beside him, his role complete once again. "You did not just hear him," Doyle said softly. "You followed him." Rex blinked once, slow, steady, and in that quiet exchange, The path ahead became clear, not because it was explained, but because it had been trusted, and now it was up to them to continue it, step by step, beyond what had been accepted, into what still waited to be understood. Doyle folded the paper once, carefully, as if the lines drawn across it could shift if handled too roughly. And for a moment he just stood there beside the open car door, the wind brushing past him, carrying the distant echo of the ceremony that had not yet resumed, but already felt like it belonged to another time, another version of the truth. Rex remained still at his side, his posture relaxed now, not because the task was finished, but because the direction had been found, and that was enough. Doyle looked down at the map again, tracing the rough lines with his eyes. The path led beyond the cemetery, beyond the service road, toward a stretch of land marked only by a single circle. No label, no explanation, just a point that existed because someone needed it to be found. Daniel's voice lingered in his mind, steady, certain, not asking, but trusting. Rex will know. Doyle exhaled slowly, then reached for his radio. This time he did not hesitate. "Control, this is Lieutenant Doyle," he said, his voice calm, measured. "I need a unit dispatched to secure the ceremony site. Maintain respect protocol, but do not proceed with burial until further notice." There was a pause on the other end, brief, confused, then a response. "Copy that, Lieutenant." Doyle lowered the radio, his gaze shifting once more toward the cemetery, now partially hidden behind rows of trees, the flag still visible in the distance, unmoving, waiting. He nodded once, not to anyone present, but to the weight of the moment itself, then turned back to Rex. "We are not done," he said quietly, and Rex responded not with sound, but with movement, stepping forward, aligning himself with the direction marked on the paper, as if the map had simply confirmed what he already knew. Doyle closed the car door gently, the sound soft but final, and together they began to walk, not hurried, not uncertain, but steady, each step carrying them farther from the place of mourning and closer to something unfinished. The road stretched ahead, damp and narrow, curving slightly as it disappeared into a line of trees that stood like silent witnesses. The air grew cooler as they moved, the scent of wet earth stronger now, mixed with the faint trace of something older, something left behind. Rex's pace remained even, his head low, his senses engaged, not searching blindly, but following a thread that had been laid out with intention. Doyle matched him step for step, the paper folded in his hand, no longer just a clue, but a continuation of trust. Minutes passed without words, the only sounds the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant call of wind through branches. And then the trees opened slightly, revealing a small clearing, unremarkable at first glance. Just a patch of ground where the grass grew uneven and the soil showed through in places. But Rex slowed as they approached, his body shifting, not tense, not alarmed, but aware. He stepped into the clearing, circling once, then stopping near the center, his nose lowering, drawing in the scent that lingered there. Doyle stepped beside him, his eyes scanning the ground, the edges, the subtle details that might have been overlooked by anyone who did not know to look. And then he saw it, faint, almost erased by time and weather, but still present, a set of impressions in the soil, not footprints exactly, but signs of movement, of presence, of something that had happened here not long ago. Doyle knelt slowly, his fingers brushing lightly against the ground, the dirt cool, slightly compacted, disturbed in a way that did not match the surrounding area. Rex remained still beside him, watching, waiting, and in that quiet moment, the pieces aligned fully, the recording, the hidden device, the map, the location. None of it had been random, none of it had been left to chance. It had been a message, a path, a final act of clarity from someone who knew that the truth might not be accepted unless it was found. Doyle stood again, his gaze steady now, no longer searching, but understanding. He looked down at Rex, who met his eyes with the same calm certainty, and for the first time since the ceremony had begun, there was no tension in the air between them, only alignment, only purpose. Doyle gave a small nod, more to himself than to the dog, then turned his gaze back to the clearing, to the place where the truth had been waiting, quiet, patient, unseen. And in the stillness that followed, there was no need for words, because some stories do not end with what is said. They end with what is found, and some bonds do not need to be proven. They reveal themselves in the moments when one refuses to let the other be forgotten. And as the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying away the last echoes of the interrupted ceremony, Rex finally lowered himself to the ground beside Doyle, not in exhaustion, not in grief, but in quiet completion, his head resting low, his breathing steady, as if to say without sound that he had done what he was meant to do. And now the rest belonged to those who had finally chosen to listen.